Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Paul Johnson. I'm Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I'm extremely pleased to welcome you to this event on the effect of Sure Start on performance in school. This is one of a number of pieces of work that my colleagues here at the IFS have been doing on the longer term effects of that amazing intervention, Sure Start, introduced right at the beginning, really, of the last Labour government, carried on through the 2000s, and then, of course, cut back fairly significantly after 2010. But an intervention which was always hoped and expected would have longer term effects, and we now really do have the evidence on some of those longer term effects. So today, the core of today will be presentations from my colleague Sarah Catton, who is a research fellow here at the IFS, also works at Nesta, and who has led for a long time our work here at the IFS on early years, and Nick Ridpath, who is a research economist here, also at the IFS. The work was carried out in conjunction with Pedro Carneiro at UCL. But before they speak, Ruth Maisey, who is Programme Head for Education at the Nuffield Foundation, will introduce. We are incredibly grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for funding this work and indeed much of our other work in this area. After Sarah and Nick have presented the results of the work, Naomi Eisenstadt and Donna Molloy will give their reflections on it. I'm very pleased indeed that both of them are here. Naomi, of course, was the director of Sure Start in the Department for Education from 1999. She and I actually worked together in the DFE way back then, at the beginning of the century, as I think we now have to call it. And Naomi was incredibly important in the rollout and design of Sure Start. And Donna Molloy, who leads work at Foundations, which used to be called the Early Intervention Foundation, and works now more broadly on evidence on the effects of early intervention in families and on children. And she will also be giving a few minutes of reflections on this. That should leave us with half an hour for questions from you, the audience. Do put your questions into Slido. You should have the Slido link. If you like other people's questions, do vote them up, because I will see the ones that have got the most votes first, and they're the most likely ones for me to ask. The various speakers, starting with Ruth, will just go one after the other. I won't interrupt, so it'll go Ruth, then Sarah and Nick, then Naomi, then Donna, and then we will have that half hour for questions. I will now shut up and leave it to Ruth to introduce the session. As I say, Ruth, thank you so much to Nuffield for funding that.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm really delighted to see so many people have been able to join us today to hear this latest instalment of the IFS's programme of research into the effects of Sure Start. For those of you who are maybe less familiar with the Nuffield Foundation, the Foundation is an independent charitable trust with a UK-wide remit, and we aim to fund research that informs social policy, primarily in education, welfare and justice. In our Education Directorate, we cover all life stages and phases from the early years to further and higher education, and we take a broad look at factors that influence education opportunity and life chances. So Sure Start cuts across these interests because its potential effects are so wide-ranging. So we welcome the opportunity to support this programme of research from that perspective, but also because of the opportunity offered by early intervention, which my colleagues discussed in depth with a series of evidence reviews which the Foundation conducted looking at the changing face of early childhood. But when we began funding this work in 2015, Sure Start was already in decline. However, we were persuaded that an evaluation of Sure Start was nonetheless justified due to the considerable public expenditure associated with the programme, and also because of the potential for this work to inform the wider and ongoing debate on the future shape of England's early years landscape and the impacts of universal services. Looking at the policy landscape now, I remain convinced of the importance of this work, since it can offer valuable lessons to newer initiatives such as the development of family hubs, And in addition, we are in the early stages of the government's Special Educational Needs and Alternative Provision Improvement Plan. So I hope that policymakers will take stock of this new analysis on how Sure Start affects academic outcomes and special educational needs identification, to consider how early provision of integrated services might form part of the solution in that sphere. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Sarah, who will tell us about the recent work that they've done, because I'm sure most people want to hear that rather than me. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ruth. So I'll share my screen to start the presentation. So yeah, thanks very much. And I'll start with a little bit of background on Sure Start. So the government launched Sure Start in 1998 as a cornerstone of its drive to tackle child poverty and social exclusion. And the program's aim was to improve the life chances of children by improving the health and well-being of families and children in the early years, so that children can flourish at home and when they get to school. And this approach really recognized the critical importance of early childhood in laying the foundations for lifelong learning, health, and well-being. And it took a holistic view of child development, aiming to improve the physical, intellectual, and social development of babies and young children at once. And to achieve that, Sure Start recognized that the needs of families, particularly disadvantaged families, are often too complex for single services to address. And it essentially pioneered a new way of joining up services around the child and the family all under one roof. And so this took the form of a network of one-stop shops or local centers, which delivered a range of services accessible to all families living in the neighborhood with a child under the age of 5. And so these services included early learning, family and parenting support, health services, as well as employment advice, all to promote child development and support parents as parents and in their aspirations to work. So the program was rolled out over a decade. Between 1999 and 2003, the government created about 500 Sure Start local programs, all located in neighborhoods with a high proportion of children living in poverty. From 2003, we see quite a shift in the government's approach to Sure Start, moving away from a centrally controlled program targeted at deprived areas towards a universal program. And this is when the Sure Start local program was relabeled Children's Centers, Sure Start Children's Centers, and when the government set a target of opening a children's center in every community by 2010. And the rollout was quick and actually kept to target, and the number of centers went from 500 to about 3,300 between 2004 and 2010. In terms of the budget, so we started with about £250 million per year. Back in 1999. The budget quadrupled by 2003 when there were 500 centers. Then between 2004 and 2010, the budget doubled from about 1 billion to 2 billion a year, while the number of centers multiplied by 7. So the average spending per center decreased, although there was still large variation across centers, and we'll talk some more about that later in the presentation. Now, since its peak in 2009-10, spending on Sure Start has actually fallen by about 75%. Many centers have closed, scaled back, or were integrated into family hubs, the new initiative to join up services around children since 2019. And again, we'll talk some more about that, I'm sure, in the discussion following the presentation. So what do we know so far about the impacts of Sure Start? Well, there's been a variety of research done on Sure Start, starting with 2 government-commissioned evaluations, one on local programs and one on children's centers. There's also been a variety of very good reports on the implementation and funding of the program, some by the National Audit Office and some others by other research organizations and think tanks. The research we're presenting today as Paul and Ruth have said, is part of a large project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, really aiming to build a comprehensive picture of the short and medium-term impacts of both local programs in children's centers on a range of children's outcomes. And a key innovation of this research really is to be able to trace out the trajectory of the impacts through childhood and adolescence. And this is really important because we know that the benefits of these type of preventative approaches can take some time to materialize. Now, in 2019, we published a first report showing substantial impacts of Sure Start on children's hospitalizations. The research we present today builds on this and looks at the impact of local programs in children's centers on academic achievement and prevalence of special education need in primary and secondary school. And we're going to publish some more research on the impacts of Sure Start on referrals to children's social care and our youth offending, and we'll bring these results together in a final report this summer, so stay tuned for that. Now, why would we be interested in looking at the impact of such program on educational outcomes? Well, a key aim of Sure Start was to improve the life chances of children, and that included their educational outcomes. So it's really important to check how the program fared against one of its intended objectives. But there are also different ways through which we could expect Sure Start to have improved or affected these outcomes. First, Sure Start offered parent-child activities, such as stay-and-play sessions for children and parents, toy libraries, as well as more specialized parenting support programs. And all of these activities had for aim to strengthen parent-child interactions, which we know are so critical for the cognitive and emotional development of children, and hence for their academic achievement. But Sure Start also provided health services, ranging from healthy eating courses and advice, breastfeeding support, and postnatal depression support groups for mothers. And these services could also have improved children's academic performance, perhaps more indirectly through improvements in child and maternal health. Lastly, we also know that Sure Start provided some childcare and parental employment advice. If this childcare was of high quality, or if it had helped parents work and increase family income, these could be other mechanisms through which Sure Start could have promoted educational attainment. However, from previous research, we think these mechanisms are unlikely to be very salient here. Finally, it's also worth noting that Sure Start provided advice and support for children and families with special education needs. So on the one hand, if these services help diagnose learning difficulties better or earlier, we could expect the program to have increased the prevalence of special education needs in school. But on the other hand, if these services actually remediated the need for special education needs support, then we could also expect to see that Sure Start would have decreased the prevalence of special education need in school. And we'll be able to look at that with the data that we have. So let me move on to say a few words about the method that we use here. So to look at the impact of Sure Start on those outcomes, we use the National Pupil Database, which collects the educational records of all state-educated children in England. We're going to be reporting impacts on the foundation stage profile score at age 5, as well on key stage outcomes at 7, 11, and 16. We'll also be looking at impacts on the prevalence of special education need at these ages. With these data and data that we have about where and when the centers open, we are able to use a robust evaluation methodology to estimate the impact on outcomes of having access to a Sure Start center between the age of 0 and 4. And we measure this access by essentially whether a child lived near a center at age 5. Now, understanding the impact of opening a center across all the children living around that center is very important for this type of area-based programs delivering universal services for their local community. But I want to make clear that it is distinct from the impact of actually using the services offered by the center. There's not a lot of data that would allow to pin down exactly what the impact of actually using these services and which services would be on these outcomes, but we gather a number of different sources, and our best estimate is that it would be a lot larger and actually up to 3.5 times the impact of having access to a center that we discuss in this presentation. So let me move on to the results and first discuss the impact of Sure Start on educational outcomes. So overall, we find that having greater access to Sure Start in the first 5 years of life increased the educational attainment of children through primary and secondary school. At age 5, we don't find significant impacts on the overall foundation stage profile score, but when we break down this measure into its subcomponents, we do see significant impacts on communication and improvements on communication and language at age 5. At age 7 and at age 11, we see significant improvements on test scores, average across English and math, and this impact persists all the way to 16, which is the last age that we were able to look at. And we found that children who live near a Sure Start center improve their GCSE score by 3% of a standard deviation, which is equivalent to an increase in about 1 grade in one GCSE subject. And as I said earlier, we think that the effect on those who actually use this center would be a lot higher, around an improvement of 2 to 3 GCSE grades at age 16. Now, turning to our second set of outcomes, we show here the impacts of the effect of having access to Sure Start on the probability of children being identified with special education need at each age, breaking down the overall effect into those receiving special education needs support with typically less severe needs, and those with an education, health and care plan or EHC plan with typically more severe needs. Interestingly, at ages 5 and 7, we see that children who had greater access to Sure Start are actually more likely to be receiving a special education needs support. And so this could suggest that the program may have helped with the detection of learning difficulties. At ages 11 and 16, there is quite a different pattern. We see that a significant decreases in the probability of having a special education need at this age because of Sure Start. And this effect is particularly strong for education, health and care plans, where we see the probability dropping by 0.3 percentage points. This is about a decrease in 1,000 children on such plans per year. And we're going to comment a bit later in the presentation, these early increases in SEN and later decreases in SEN are likely to reflect different effects on different groups of children. And now I'm going to hand over to Nick to elaborate further on who benefited most from Sure Start and what may have made the program so effective.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So yes, as Sarah said, I'm going to talk for a little while to break these results down a bit. And first, I'm going to look at which groups particularly benefited from Sure Start. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the mechanisms by which Sure Start might have had these effects that Sarah has just shown. So when we think about who benefited, the key thing we want to think about is socioeconomic background. Sorry, I've got a problem with my slides there. Sure Start itself was designed with the intention of ameliorating the impact of child poverty. From an academic perspective, children from low-income backgrounds face a significant disadvantage gap in academic achievement. To put that in perspective, children who were eligible for free school meals are about half as likely to get 5 A stars to C in GCSE as those who are not in the time period we're looking at. And so, given that the aim of Sure Start was to try and reduce this effect, it's important to break down these results by income to try and work out what's going on here. Another reason why this might be important is that until 2006, Sure Start centres were particularly targeted at the most deprived areas, so at the 20% most deprived areas in England. That doesn't mean they weren't universal. They were almost always accessible to all children, but they were designed in such a way that they might have particularly large impacts for children from low-income families. And this also applied to the services they offered. So a range of the services, such as the employment support and some of the outreach to groups who might be less likely to use these kind of services, were particularly targeted at low-income families. So that's another reason why we might think Sure Start was more effective for children from low-income backgrounds, which is why it's important that we look at this as well. So to do this, we calculate the effects that Sarah has just presented separately for children eligible for free school meals and children who are not eligible for free school meals, all at age 5, so around the time at which they might have been going to Sure Start. For context, the children eligible for free school meals represent approximately the 15 to 20% of children from the lowest income backgrounds in the country. So that's kind of the threshold we're looking at there, and then we're comparing them to the other 80% or so of the population. So what I'm going to show you here is the same results Sarah just showed, but first in green for children who are not eligible for free school meals, and then in yellow for children who were. So in green, what we see is that we still see these positive effects at age 11 and 16. Note the scales had to change here. So these results, while slightly smaller than what Sarah showed for the whole population, are still significant and positive. There was still an improvement in GCSEs and in year 11 test results, age 11 test results from attending a Sure Start centre. Slightly smaller than that for the population as a whole. But for those children who were eligible for free school meals, we see much, much larger effects. And this is particularly true at age 5, where we see a big positive effect across a range of development characteristics, both communications and mathematics and sort of social and creativity scores. And it's also very true at GCSE. So at age 16, we see a large increase, a much larger, 6 times larger than for non-free school meal students, on free school meal students from having lived close to a Sure Start centre. And to put this GCSE result in context, this is equivalent to about 12% of a standard deviation, which is about 3 GCSE grades. So the equivalent of going, for example, from 2 Bs and 3 Cs to getting 5 Bs in your GCSEs. And that's quite a significant effect. And I should also remind you, as Sarah said, this is just the effect of living near a centre relative to not living near a centre. We expect the effect on children from low-income backgrounds from actually using centres to be much higher than this. There's a similar story when we look at the effect on special educational needs. For children not eligible for free school meals, we see a similar pattern as we saw for the whole population, although again, we see these increases at age 5 and 7, and then we see a decrease at age 11, although we don't see this decrease at age 16. So it's a similar pattern to the rest of the population. But for children on free school meals, we see a very different pattern, where we see negative, though not always statistically significant, differences, effects from living near a Sure Start centre at all ages. This suggests that a lot of the effect of the work that children's centres and local programmes were doing, and particularly local programmes were doing to provide support with special educational needs, may have had an effect in the long run. As Sarah mentioned, this also suggests that the increases at age 5 and 7 and the decreases at age 11 and 16 are not necessarily related factors. They don't seem to be happening to the same groups at the 2 ages. That's something to bear in mind. So that's the breakdown of how Sure Start affected groups, particularly by income, differently. But it's also important to think about how it was that Sure Start did this. So what I'm going to show you here is the effect of 2 different types of Sure Start centre. So Sure Start local programmes were those centres that opened before 2003, and they had a very different sort of structure and setup than Sure Start's children's centres, which are the centres that opened from 2004 onwards. What I want to emphasise here is that these local programmes continued, while they rebranded as children's centres in 2004, they had a different funding mechanism and different setup all the way up until 2010. So these results just reflect 2 different types of programmes throughout the throughout the period we're considering from 1999 to 2010. And I'm going to show you both of them at the same time. Local programs will be in green and children's centres will be in yellow. So what we can see is that local programs have much bigger impacts than children's centres. Children's centres don't seem to have had a statistically significant impact on academic achievement at any age, whereas at ages 11 and 16, Sure Start local programs had very large effects on academic outcomes. And this suggests that local programs may have been much more effective in what they would do. The things that local programs were doing that children's centres weren't may have been particularly effective. So what is it that local programs were doing that children's centres weren't? The key thing and the highlight of it, and the main thing to bear in mind is that local programs spent a lot more than children's centres. So as Sarah showed, the budget before 2003 per centre was much larger than the budget after 2003 per centre. So in the early years, they were spending much more. But even in 2008 and 2009, as we know from the National Audit Office, centres that were originally founded as local programs had much higher budgets, and this is the median budget for a sample that the National Audit Office took, than phase 1 centres, which targeted particularly deprived areas, and phase 2 centres, which targeted slightly less deprived areas. So it seems that there's particularly large returns to this extra funding that local programs were receiving relative to children's centres. But it's also important to look into what specifically these local programs were spending the extra money on. So one key thing is that they were spending more money on parental outreach. And this consisted mostly of sort of home visits and outreach and encouragement to families who might be less likely to use a Sure Start centre, but who might particularly benefit to come and use the centre and to provide the services that the Sure Start centres provided. This was obviously a particularly expensive practice because it involved sending staff around the area and it couldn't all just be done from the centre. And so having a higher budget allowed them to do this. This meant that they reached out to a much greater number of parents. The average, the National Audit Office found that the average local programme reached out to about twice as many parents as phase 1 and phase 2 centres did, suggesting that this extra funding allowed them to do this quite a lot. Another thing they spent money on, in fact, disproportionately more money on, and a higher proportion of their budget than children's centres on, was teacher input to learning development. So in the kind of early learning sessions and parent-child development sessions, local programs had spent a lot more on getting input from qualified teachers into this development. So this is another thing we might think was particularly important, particularly when we're thinking about academic outcomes. And finally, less about the budget. Sure Start local programs had a lot more engagement of the local community, and this was particularly prior to 2004. In the first phase of the rollout of Sure Start, there was the government's prescription of what centres had to do was much less prescriptive. So there was a lot more community input in what services families in the local area particularly thought they needed. And from 2004 onwards, in both the former local programs and the children's centres, this was rolled back a little. So that's another thing that might have made a difference. So now we've thought about who benefited particularly from Sure Start and why that might have been. We think it's useful to break this down into a cost and benefit analysis to really get at the whole effect, or to get part of the way to the effect of Sure Start in terms of the financial benefits as well as the academic benefits. So by 2010, which was the sort of peak of spending on Sure Start, including both operating and current spending and capital spending on building new centres, the spending on Sure Start was £2.52 billion in today's prices. However, when we are thinking about the long-run costs of Sure Start, we also want to think about the savings that might have been made by the government as a result of the effects of Sure Start. And the key one of those that we can think about in this paper is the changes to SEN need, and in particular to the reductions in education, health and care plans that Sarah mentioned. Now, a reduction in this, we estimate saved the government approximately £200 million in today's prices. But there will be other things that would have also affected costs that are slightly outside the scope of the academic area. So the first of these, which Sarah has already mentioned, is that Sure Start, earlier IFS work has shown that Sure Start reduced hospitalizations which would have saved the NHS significantly. They estimate approximately 30% of the total upfront costs of Sure Start would have been saved in the long run by savings by the NHS. And there may also be other factors which we have forthcoming work on. So Sure Start might have affected youth violence and youth offending. It might also have affected children's social care, which would have implications for costs for the government. Meanwhile, when we think about benefits, improved GCSEs, as the DFE have some work showing this, are associated with significantly higher earnings in the long run. So we estimate that over the lifetime of the children who attended Sure Start centres, the improvement in GCSEs that we see because of Sure Start would amount to about £2.5 billion in total extra earnings over the course of their lifetime, similar to the total upfront costs of Sure Start. To put this in perspective, using our central estimate for how many children were attending, we think this is around £6,000 and £7,000 per child attending over the course of their life. And so if we compare these two things, if we compare these costs and these benefits, we get that for every £1 the government spent on Sure Start, they could expect a benefit of about £1.09 back. However, it's important to emphasise that this is just from the academic angle of the outcomes of Sure Start. We already know about the reduction in costs from hospitalisation, and there is forthcoming work on youth offending and children's social care. Hopefully, once we have put that all together, we will be able to do a more comprehensive cost-benefit analysis of Sure Start. So what are the key takeaways from this report? The first is that Sure Start has significant positive effects on grades and positive as in a reduction in SEN throughout adolescence. And in particular, that for children from low-income backgrounds, these effects were very large. We also know that Sure Start local programs were disproportionately effective from an academic perspective. This might have been because of their higher budgets, which included more spending on parental outreach, more spending on teacher input, and greater local and community input. And then the final takeaway to bear in mind is that there is a modest but positive benefit cost ratio. Although this is particularly large for this, we can expect this benefit to be much larger for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. But it's also important to bear in mind that other effects of Sure Start need consideration. And that's all we have time for on the report. Thank you all very much for listening, and I will hand over to Naomi and then Donna to talk through their thoughts on this.
Thank you very much. First of all, I can't thank you enough. I can't thank IFS enough, and indeed Nuffield enough, for doing this research and how personally thrilled I am about it. I've got 5 minutes, and I could go on for hours, as you can imagine, but I won't. First, I want to say that Sarah is slightly wrong about pioneering a new way. What happened is that Norman Glass, who was a brilliant civil servant in the Treasury, sadly passed now, went around visiting across the country places that he was told might be doing interesting work. And Hillfields in Coventry was one, Pen Green in Corby was one, Coram Family was one, where they were already doing this kind of work, but it was on a very piecemeal basis, sometimes charities, sometimes local authorities. But Norman saw this and decided that we should make it a national program. I think that the other thing that's important to say is that what are the key features that make it different? And I think that they were alluded to by Nick and by Sarah. But the area-based notion was extremely important in terms of you selected an area based on a population that's likely to be poor, but you have it open to all families, which avoids stigma, but it also encourages social mixing. Sure Start was greatly criticized about middle-class people taking over. I said, gee, first time middle-class people want to use something that's for poor people. Isn't that good? So I think that that notion about open access is extremely important. And I fear that family hubs are much more targeted in terms of social care needs of children and families, not an open access program. The downside of open access and targeted in poor areas is that we did not do well in rural areas. It's very, very hard to have a similar approach in rural areas because you don't have the very large concentration of poor children. I think another key feature that was extremely important in Sure Start, and I think was the magic, and this is alluded to it in the report, that in the beginning there was a massive, massive emphasis led really by David Blunkett and by Tessa Jowell on community engagement. So it was clear that there were things that we wanted to do that we knew were good for children, but we actually worked very, very hard with local people on reciprocity, on what they thought was needed in their community. And we did a very delicate mix, and some programs did this really well and some not so well, of what do you think is needed and what do we as professionals think is needed, and how you balance those things out. So my line has always been, of course, I believe in evidence-based parenting programs, but if my washing machine is broken, actually that's the top of my priority. And be able to respond to local needs as they appeared, I think was a very strong key. Another point I want to make about the reciprocity is that the emphasis on the outreach really interests me, because it was the area that we did the outreach because our first evaluation showed that we were failing the children of teen parents, and that teen parents weren't coming, and those children were doing less well in Sure Start areas than in other areas. Because we saw that in a very early evaluation, we got extra money to do the outreach work and what I would call assertive outreach. And the outreach work was highly dependent on shared data, particularly with health. So in some areas, the health agencies were willing to tell us where the pregnant women were, where the new babies were born, so that we could do the visits. If we didn't have the data, we couldn't do the visits. And again, this is a very important lesson for any future plans about integrated work at local level. The combination about what parents want and what the data tells us, and what the data tells us on where the people who need the help the most are, is absolutely crucial to the kind of success at reaching the people that we wanted to reach. I suppose the last thing I want to say is I was intrigued by the biggest effect at 5 was on language and communication, because I've said in the past that if I had had one aim for Sure Start, and indeed for the Lottery Better Start program and for other programs, the one thing is language development, because we know that it is a key to all other future success. And it's also a key to engagement with civic life as it is. So I was really pleased to see that there was impact on language development. And I'll close 20 seconds early by saying again how grateful I am and how thrilled I am with the work. Thank you very much. And I'll pass on to Donna.
Thanks very much, Naomi. Great to be able to follow those comments. I suppose the first thing I'd say, just to reiterate other comments, is how fantastic it is to see this further evidence that early intervention and support for early childhood development can make such a significant and positive difference to children's lives. We've all known for a long time, and Nick talked about this, that inequalities in children's development open up early, and we know that well-targeted and effective family support can help reduce income-related learning gaps and improve a range of other outcomes that government and local services care about. And we know this from individual programme-specific interventions. So it's really excellent to have evidence about the positive impact on GCSE results from something on the scale of the early Sure Start local programmes, which really reinforces what we know more widely. And there is, of course, ongoing interest in national family support programmes to support children's outcomes, as we see through current policy on family hubs and the Best Start in Life programme. And I would argue that what comes next must draw on lessons from Sure Start, as well as the last few years of DFE policy on family hubs. And obviously there are significant differences here in terms of the scale of funding and the focus and so on. But what we need now is to draw on the best of both models and create what we need for the current context. So I was asked to say a few words about the implications for current and future policy, and there are 3 things I think that I'd like to draw out. The first is about the importance of carefully designed and adequately funded family support. This study shows that intervening in early childhood to support families and promote positive child development can yield important results when those programmes are well designed and well funded. And we see in these findings, it's really interesting, the strongest evidence of positive outcomes in the earliest rollout of Sure Start local programmes. And so goes without saying that any reform to the existing system must have adequate investment at its heart. I'd also argue it's crucial that we continue to focus on evidence-based support. There's not always been enough attention on this. I think lack of use of evidenced interventions has been an issue both for Sure Start and for some of the current work on family hubs. And we would argue that where we have good evidence of interventions or activities that have been shown to improve outcomes, we should be using this rather than reinventing wheels or constantly developing new service models. And we see time and time again in some of our work at foundations a gap between the things shown to work through high quality studies and what sometimes gets commissioned and delivered locally. My second point would be building on some of what Naomi said, the importance of targeted help for disadvantaged families. So the fact that the IFS analysis has found much larger impacts for those from the poorest and minoritised ethnic backgrounds, and the fact that it's reasonable to hypothesise that the greater focus on parental outreach in the early Sure Start local programmes meant reaching more disadvantaged families who were able to benefit more from the support provided. And this is completely in line with what we know from wider evidence. At Foundations, we spend a lot of time reviewing the strength of evidence for different approaches to support families and see time and time again the strongest effects are often from targeted programmes with a very clear target population and rationale. Generic and universal programmes, which often attempt to achieve multiple outcomes for diverse populations, often do not make the sort of difference that we would like to see, which suggests going forward, we should be focusing on targeted support for the most disadvantaged families, which might be about looking at specific groups in the population or prioritising disadvantaged areas, as we've seen from Sure Start local programmes. I don't think this means that we can't have open access, but we mustn't lose that focus on targeting support. And I think we'd argue currently there is a lack of targeted support to prevent adversity in early childhood. My third point is to make the case for longer term evaluation and to congratulate the IFS's ambition in tracking the long-term policy outcomes from such a flagship policy 2 decades later. As ever, we see that some policy decisions about Sure Start were taken before we had the data about the impact that Sure Start was having. And we just don't do enough of long-term evaluation. We see a dearth of this in terms of the evidence that's available to inform current policy. Often we don't evaluate at all, or if we do, we only look at short-term effects, which just means that all too often when making decisions about policy and services, we're operating in the dark. And I think it's fair to say more could be done at the moment to collect high quality data on both child and parent level outcomes in both the family hubs and Start for Life programmes. And then my final point just before finishing, I suppose, is just a few thoughts about the crucial role of government in setting the vision. Here, we know that parenting and the parent-child relationship is one of the most important influences on children's development. And the next government, I think we would all argue, should strengthen access to high-quality local family support services, which start in maternity and run throughout childhood. This requires policy clarity to confirm the national vision for children's centres and family hubs as part of early childhood services. I think just to make a blindingly obvious point, the first step has to be about developing clear policy objectives and about whether this is about support for all, reducing inequalities in child development, or something else. Obviously, as ever, there are choices here. It's also important to be really clear about the sufficient funding needed as a necessary condition for change. It goes without saying that any new vision as we move forward must reflect the current context of increased complexity and overstretched services. We need a vision which focuses on evidence-based support models, I would argue, with funding and incentives for local areas to deliver proven models and with key levers in the system, such as inspection, reinforcing use of the models and activities shown to work. I think it's crucial this national vision is shared across departments with a single vehicle for supporting families and early childhood development. I think it's interesting to see that the structure and funding of the Family Hub model has forced cross-government integration in recent years, which was sometimes an area in which Sure Start struggled. And my final point is that we need to hold our nerve. One reflection on the last few decades of policy initiatives in this space is that we often have the right ambitions or try to do the right things, but how we go about achieving these ambitions can be insufficient. We don't always stay the course in terms of setting a vision, investing in what's been shown to make a difference, evaluating, and then crucially acting on those results. And the new government offers an opportunity to get this right. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Nick.
To Paul even.
Paul, apologies.
Thanks ever so much, Donna. Thank you, Naomi, Nick, and Sarah, and indeed Ruth. Fantastic presentations. A lot of questions. We've got half an hour to get through them. I won't ask everyone to answer every question because there are quite a lot of very, very good questions here. I'll start at the top and then I'll sort of dot around in terms of where we are. But actually kind of what, Donna, I think you were referring to right at the end there is this question from Susan Murray, which says, Sure Start was axed against evidence and advice. What lessons can be learnt for the future to stop good initiatives being lost? And I think part of the answer is very much what you were saying, Donna, about the lack of consistency in policy. And it's not just here. We do see between governments and indeed within governments, in some areas, early years is one, further education is another, where policy is just massively inconsistent over time, let alone any attention to the evidence base. But perhaps perhaps Naomi, you could reflect on the use of evidence in the initial construction of Sure Start and your reflections on why that evidence didn't result in it continuing.
The interesting thing is, and there have been arguments about this for years and years and years, there was significant evidence from decades that intervening early, particularly with low-income families, was absolutely crucial, and that it made the biggest difference to the poorest kids. The nature of what that intervention should be, and this is probably where Donna and I disagree a bit, is that there was a huge argument about, should we do the same thing at every program so that you could do a proper randomized controlled trial and build a strong evidence base on what works? And our difficulty was there was so much variety in what was available for young children from area to area that if you did the same thing everywhere and you could do a randomized controlled trial to create a strong evidence base, you'd be doing the wrong things in some places. And there was a very strong emphasis from ministers on local community decision-making and participation in what was on offer locally. So there is a tension. And I would argue that Sure Start is not an intervention, it's a system reform. It's trying to bring local agencies together to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. It wasn't an intervention in the sense of a parenting program that has a number of sessions and has a particular curriculum. That's what we were encouraged to do by the academics and that we resisted very strongly. So building the evidence took a very long time. And I think Donna's absolutely right about holding their nerve and absolutely right about what is the core aim and how do you try not to have too many aims at once. So I think it's much harder, it's much riskier, and I'm absolutely convinced that some programs were brilliant and some weren't so good. But we didn't have long enough then to start teasing out and learning from each other rather than doing a big evaluation and saying, aha, now we know it works, everybody do this. Because what I said to David Miliband once is, yes, we shouldn't reinvent the wheels, but everybody needs their own hubcaps. The feeling of it being local is important. The feeling of local ownership is important. Whether in fact it's different is kind of irrelevant.
That's a really interesting set of reflections. And of course, I mean, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this, Naomi, just sort of, I mean, it goes very much against the culture in Whitehall to some extent then, and possibly even more so now, this idea of giving that degree of local control. And as Nick and Sarah showed, it was that period when there was both more money, but also more local control, when the results seem to be most positive. I mean, what's your sense of the capacity for Whitehall to let go to the extent that was required for that early part of Sure Start, and indeed to what extent did that certainly in the newer centres, did that local that local control get lost?
Okay, I'll try to be quick so I don't take all the time. So in terms of Whitehall, for ministers that had huge portfolios, this was like a comfort zone. So they could kind of experiment with local control because there was lots of controls of lots of other stuff. So within education, there was a literacy strategy and a numeracy strategy. You know, there was lots of control. So this is the one little area where they could kind of let go a bit and have fun. And of course, it was great. You know, for me and the civil servants working on this, it was just a new way of doing it. So I think that the general tendency is to control from Whitehall. And I think that Donna's right, the general tendency in terms of department by department. So there was also a lot of work about working cross department between education and health, and then between education and DWP. So there were lots of ways that this flagship was trying to demonstrate new ways of working. And indeed, we find out 20 years later that those new ways of working seem to work, but it's too long to wait in terms of the cycle, and particularly in terms of a minister's time in office. So I think there are structural reasons that work against the long term that you know as well, you know better than I do, Paul, in all areas of government. So I think the letting go was extremely important.
Really interesting. Sarah, there's several questions here actually of the form. There's a heck of a lot going on at this time. There were big increases in tax credits. There were other changes to education that were going on. How have you disentangled the impact of Sure Start from everything else that was going on at the time?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. So the methodology that we use really try to hone in on the impact of Sure Start, and we do a variety of checks to indeed make sure that the results that we find were not driven by the big increase in the free entitlement funding that was going on at the time, or the generosity of tax credit that led to increases in employment among these groups. Now we know, for example, from other research, that the big expansion in the free entitlement to childcare, so those first 15 hours of free childcare that was introduced pretty much at the same time of Sure Start, did not lead to much improvements in academic outcomes. And the researchers who've done these studies are looking they're using the same data, looking at the same outcomes as we are. There is slightly bigger impacts for low-income children as well, but overall, much less evidence of impact. So together, we still don't quite know the impact of, I think, the increase in generosity of working tax credits, for example, during this period, what impact these had on children's outcomes. And I think there's actually research at IFS being done on this. But in terms of the method that we use, we've done quite a lot of checks to make sure to control for these potential confounding influences.
Great, thank you. Question from Kathy Silver, really asking, it's important to know exactly what these centres were doing in order to, if we're going to plan new programs, if we're going to have the evidence for what to do next, how much do we know? And this is really digging into what you're saying as part of the presentations. How much do we actually know about what it was that worked?
Shall I answer that, and Nick can jump in
Yeah,
if
sure.
more to add. So unfortunately, there's very little information available today on the exact services that were offered and that were taken up by children and families across this period and across and that makes it really difficult to really disentangle which services were most effective. In terms of, I think the question by Kathy also was asking as to whether we think early education, the provision of early education was important. What we know from the government commissioned evaluation of local programs in children's centers is that it's actually quite unlikely that Sure Start played a big role in increasing the provision of childcare. If it did, or early education and childcare, if it did, it is likely that it would have been of high quality, but we think that the scale at which it would have done so is really quite too small to explain some of the impacts that we find. Now, just going back to the, which services were mostly effective. So we were left to essentially look at the sort of impacts we find on a variety of outcomes. And here I'm going to refer a little bit to the research that we did on the children's hospitalizations as well. Essentially, what we find across these two pieces of research are improvements in academic achievement, as we've seen. On the health side, we see increases in children's hospitalizations in infancy, but then decreases, and quite substantial decreases in children's hospitalizations. And when we dig further into which hospitalizations were actually averted, we see that those hospitalizations coming from injuries and accidents, as well as mental health related hospitalizations that were averted. So all of this, I think we think suggests that it is those services within Sure Start local programs or centers that improved most likely parent-child interactions and the quality of the home environment that are likely to have led to some of the outcomes, some of the impacts that we find across these studies. And that may have started with improvements in communication and language, but we also see at age 5 in the research we published today, improvements in emotional and behavioral development of children. And all of these would have then essentially helped children get ready for school and then be more ready to learn throughout primary and secondary school. And that is also why we think we see such decreases in hospitalizations related to injuries and accidents, because children who are calmer, who are more attentive, not only do better in school, but also have less injuries and accidents. Now, just a last point related to what Donna said. I think it is quite a tragedy, actually, that we're not able to understand better what services were effective, because that's really key to design whatever the future of whatever initiative going forward in a cost-effective way. And I would really call for much better data and monitoring, actually, of what, even in a system where there is a lot of local autonomy to design programs in the way that they think best address local needs. I think we do need to understand what actually works even locally for those local populations. And unfortunately, there is very little information at the moment about what's happened over the last 20 years that would allow us to really be quite confident about what worked.
Donna, would you like to come in on that, particularly the issue of your experience of how well evidence in this area is understood, what we know from this policy, and anything we may have learned since?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the first point, just to reiterate Sarah's point, I think the fact that we have so little good quality data often about what's happening in practice and what families are receiving and which models are being delivered and made available is a significant problem. And it feels like we have this conversation every few years and think, can we have another go at really trying to crack this? And we're not there yet. So I think we need to keep that front of mind as we move forward. I suppose the point I would make is that there is an enormous amount we don't know in terms of what works, but I suppose just, and Naomi, I think this is back to your point about achieving that balance between services which are responsive to the needs of local communities and that families want and that families will access, but also not getting into a situation where that means just anything goes and we are not drawing on what we know makes a difference in terms of improving children's outcomes. And we do know some stuff in this space. We have foundations, we have an online toolkit which has something like 130 different parenting family support models which have been shown to improve outcomes. And we need to make sure we are constantly drawing on that evidence about what makes the most difference in terms of guiding decisions about service design and commissioning at local level. And I think the role of the centre here is finding that right balance between local autonomy and discretion and central guidance, and making sure that where we do know what works, that information is clearly articulated and put front and central so that areas can draw on that as they make decisions about what to do. And I think it's been interesting, the DFE in terms of family hubs have produced quite a lot of guidance in recent years about which models are strongest and might be part of a local family hub's offer. And I think there's learning there about how we make sure that information is available and drawn on, but which doesn't overly tie the hands of those making decisions locally so that they can respond to the needs of their local communities.
Sorry, I was muted because I was coughing. There's a few questions here about the balance between targeting and universality. There's some from different perspectives. One's sort of suggesting that the pressure for universality may have made this less effective. Others suggesting that it was the very fact that it was a universally available service that may have made it effective. Do any of the panel have a view on that balance and the way that was struck within Sure Start?
Can I go, Paul?
Sure, yes, please.
I do have a strong view, but the problem is it's a highly problematic view in the sense that I think targeting in poor areas was right. I think that initial design, which I had nothing to do with, was absolutely right. I think the difficulty comes in, first of all, it is a problem in terms of rural areas. So you need much more individual family targeting in rural areas because you don't have the concentrations of the community development model that worked so well for Sure Start. I think that once the decision was taken to go everywhere, not only did it thin out the money too much, but it also lost the sense of what the main purpose was. So it lost the kind of looking for the evidence-based stuff that Donna was talking about. You know, it just lost that sort of core purpose. And I think the place where I have most dilemma is that had we not gone everywhere, I don't think we would be having this conversation today. Because if we had stick to those 500 local programs in poor areas on day one of 2010 election, it would have disappeared from the face of the earth and nobody would have noticed it or noticed that it gone, because it's very easy to cut stuff for poor people. Once you put Sure Start everywhere, you had David Cameron's mother on the picket line trying to keep her children's center open. Now, that's my dilemma in it all. I actually think going everywhere was wrong for the purpose, but right in terms of you created an expectation for everyone. But you know, I still would spend the most money in the poorest areas and then ensure that attached to every primary school was some form of integrated support, but on a much more, you know, low cost, informal level than what we think of as what went into those local programs.
That's really interesting. And it's, I guess it's a more general reflection on the political economy of these kinds of things. It's much harder to abolish universal things, but they may not of themselves fit the cost-benefit analysis anywhere near so well.
Exactly.
There's a great point here. I mean, I don't know whether there's a bunch of work to be done, but I don't know if anyone knows about this. Kevin Duggan has just said that Sure Start in Northern Ireland has got a regional database of all the projects, what service is being offered and to how many parents and children and so on. So maybe there is a an opportunity for some evaluation in Northern Ireland. There's several questions here of the form: do we know anything about the impact of Sure Start on the parents, and in particular on the mothers? Does anyone have any response to that? Is that something, Sarah? Presumably that's not part of our work.
Only sort of on a secondary sort of order, because there isn't as much good data on maternal outcomes, I think, as there are on children's outcomes that we could use for this. Just a couple of thoughts on that. So first, we did look using survey data in the health work at whether there were impacts on maternal employment and family income as a result of having greater access to Sure Start, and we didn't find much evidence of that. Now, from government evaluations, I think it's the evaluation of children's centres in England, ECI. I believe that they did find impacts on maternal mental health, as well as improvements in family functioning. So those would be measures to try and look at the sort of quality of the home environment. So that's not specifically a parent outcome, but that's more a family outcome. And they did find improvements on those measures as a result, I think, among families who had greater use of the centers. And so I think that, again, sort of corroborates, I think, our suspicion that the services that were likely to be most effective in driving some of these impacts that we see here really had to do with those activities that strengthened, parent-child interactions and the home environment.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions. Again, this is for Sarah and Nick, really, of the form. You're using distance from the Sure Start Centre rather than use of it. Is that good enough? I mean, and I think related, is there a potential problem with the methodology if these started off being poor areas and they became more affluent over time, but perhaps through some regression to the mean? So I think there's a couple of questions really about the methodology. Is distance, does that tell you enough? And have you been able to control for potential regression to the mean in terms of how well off the early areas were?
I'm happy to take this one. So I think this sort of comes into what Donna and Sarah have been saying about evidence, which is I think we would much rather have been looking at the effect of Sure Start, or the effect of using Sure Start on all of these things. But what we have data on is where children lived, and so whether they live nearby. There is some evidence on sort of how many children live nearby and how many families were using centres. That means we can get this kind of rough heuristic from the effect of living near a centre to the effect of using it. And as Sarah said, we think it's somewhere between, for the kind of broad estimates for the whole population, we think that the effect sizes that we've been looking at from living nearby translate into 2.5 to 3.5 times larger effects of using a centre. And that feeds into the cost benefit analysis we're doing. I think in terms of the sort of regression to the mean point and these areas get better, that's not something we're too worried about. As Sarah said, there weren't big effects on sort of parental employment in the short run. And so the effects we're seeing in terms of Sure Start are quite long term. So kids who were born in 1999 were only taking their GCSEs in 2015, and Sure Start was mostly deprecated by then. So we shouldn't really think things are sort of spiraling onto it to themselves.
Question from Susanna Todd. Did we find anything out about use and effect by different ethnic origins?
I can also take this one, actually. Yes, so we did, actually. We have found larger effects for non-white children than for white children. We don't have quite enough statistical power to break that down beyond whether children were ethnic minorities or not. But we find larger effects both amongst children on free school meals. So children on free school meals from non-white areas have the largest effects, And amongst children not on free school meals, we also see larger effects for children from ethnic minorities. What we aren't able to do is break down how much of this is a factor of, as Naomi was saying, this sort of urban-rural divide, because a lot of, if Naomi is correct in that there are these larger effects in urban areas because it's easier to sort of build this community-based program, that would, by as a function of more ethnic minorities living in urban areas, mean that the effects were larger. So we can't say anything with any confidence about whether this is something about whether this is causal. Although we do see, and this is something else in the report, that children who spoke English as a second language, something else that's correlated with ethnicity, benefited much more. And I think this comes into the kind of communication and language effects we talked about earlier.
Really interesting. We're getting towards the end of our time, so there's a question at the top here, which I think gives you all an opportunity to really sort of wrap up about, which is asking what lessons does the research tell us about how best to capture more generally capture the impact of early years interventions, what measures and indicators would be helpful in the short run, because obviously one of the issues here is timescale. You're doing early interventions, you can collect information in the short run, but actually you're looking at effects here 10, 15 years on. Governments barely managed to kind of focus for 10, 15 minutes, let alone 10, 15 years. So does this tell us anything about the, I mean, what do we learn from this and from other work in terms of what can be really helpful more quickly, and what's telling us about what's going to happen in the future and therefore impacting policy? I mean, I'm going to give you all a sort of final shot at this. Why don't we start with Donna and Naomi, and then end with Nick and Sarah.
So yeah, thank you, Paul. So very big question. I mean, just to say, there's a huge amount of really valuable work going on this whole area at the moment. So looking at what possible new core outcome sets might consist of for the early years, and what the measures are that could track progress against those different measures. And I don't think it's beyond us to get to a consensus position on what should be the things that we should measure when looking at the impact of early years interventions. Longer conversation than we can have here, but maybe something we could follow up on, because to have a consistent set of things that we capture routinely, I think would just build that evaluation infrastructure we so sort of dearly need in this space as we move forward.
So, really hard. I think we have everyone knows there's no magic bullet, but I think there's also a series of both ands, not either ors, and tensions to be managed. So we've already talked about the tension to be managed between targeted and universal. There's a tension to be managed between evidence-based and what people actually want and will engage in, and how you do that reciprocal negotiation. There's a tension to be managed between the current debate, which I find abhorrent, on number of free hours versus what is a quality experience for young children. The debate, it seems, completely about labor force participation, not just quality of experience in terms of long-term outcomes, but the joys of being a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old. I mean, I just think we have to remember that there are other reasons to do this business that have to do with love as well as money, and have to do with short-term as well as long-term. So I would say that we need some core principles, and we need to evaluate as we go along, but also not forget that that early childhood is a wonderful time for children and a wonderful time for parents. And my last plea in terms of policy isn't about integrated services. It's about 1 year's paid parental leave. So so those are sorts of short-term things I think we should do that are really important, but always hold on to the joy of childhood.
Brilliant. Sarah, Nick, any last reflections on this?
One thing I'll say, which I thought was interesting on the question of how these things last, is when I was digging around just for some weird bit of data in a select committee hearing to try and find something else, in 2008, Sadiq Khan, who was then an MP for Tooting, at one point went, what do you mean we won't know about this for another 10 or 15 years? How can we possibly work with this? So it is really difficult, and I think everyone will find that really difficult. So I think it's something to bear in mind that these things take time.
Yeah, that was rather like the Nick Clegg quote from 2011 says no point investing in nuclear power because it won't come online till 2022. Well, 2022 arrived.
So final words from me, and it's hard to come after 3 colleagues here. But essentially, just on the question about what sort of information we should be collecting as we roll out these sort of initiatives, I think obviously we have to wait to see the benefits on these, more long-term outcomes. But there are lots of things in the short term that can tell us whether we're on the right track or not. I'd emphasize Donna's point about collecting more routine information about where very young children stand in terms of their development. We've got some, the health review at age 2.5, but those data are maybe not of the quality that we would need. They're also not really accessible on an individual level. And so I'd sort of try and improve that. And then I'd really try and emphasize, to try and get a bit more information about what we think are going to be actually changed on the pathway to those long-term outcomes. And these have to do with, parental outcomes, family outcomes, measures of the family environment, and the use of public services during these crucial early years. I think from that, we can really get an indication of whether we're on the right track with whatever is being delivered. And if we've got good information on what's being delivered and how much parents are actually taking these things up, we can sort of course correct as we go.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. A final comment I'll say that I saw Liz Sewell put in the Slido. Thank you to Naomi for mentioning Norman Glass, a wonderful man, which I think we will all agree with. But I also agree with Naomi, 2- and 3-year-olds are very lovely. Which we should not forget as we do all of this work. Thank you so much again to Ruth and to the Nuffield Foundation for funding this, to Sarah, Nick, and our colleague Pedro for doing this fantastic work, which I hope will be really influential among all of the things that we've done over a long period of time here at the IFS. I think this kind of really work looking at the causation, what actually affects outcomes of this kind ought to be really, really impactful both here and internationally. Thank you to Donna and to Naomi for those fantastic comments, and thank you everyone who has been watching and listening, and keep watching and listening because there is even more to come on the impacts of Sure Start later in the year.